everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 300 library systems across the United States, Canada, and New Zealand with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our Author Talk series. Today, we are so excited to welcome New York Times best-selling and award-winning author Robert Jones Jr. to talk to us about his beautiful novel, The Prophets. How are you, Robert? Welcome.
Hi, Brandon. Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well. How are you?
I am doing fantastic. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too.
Before we do get started, though, I just want to give that kind of standard housekeeping information to everybody that keeps everything running smoothly, and then we'll dive right in. We have compiled some of the viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, so thank you for doing that. But of course, we'll be taking additional questions throughout the entirety of the talk. So when you have a question for Robert, you can go ahead and click that questions button. It's just below this live stream. There are 3 tabs there. One says questions. If you are unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you will be receiving a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours. And in that email, you can find a link to the recording to go ahead and finish out the talk. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today. Robert Jones Jr., formerly known online as Son of Baldwin, is a Brooklyn-based award-winning writer. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling novel, The Prophets, which won the 2022 Publishing Triangle Edmund White Award for debut fiction and was a finalist for the 2021 National Book Award for fiction. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Essence, Variety, and the Paris Review, as well as in the critically acclaimed anthologies 400 Souls and the 1619 Project. His latest work can be found in his newsletter, Witness, at robertjonesjr.substract.com. Again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We are so happy to have you today.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you for having me, truly.
Of course, the pleasure is all mine. So we like to start off with maybe just a quick summary of The Prophets for those who haven't had a chance to either pick it up yet or to read it all the way through.
The Prophets is, in essence, a love story involving 2 enslaved young men on a plantation in Mississippi during antebellum slavery, Samuel and Isaiah. They fall in love, and the book sort of examines how that love transforms and inspires and maybe even destroys things that happened around them. And there's also a tract that goes back further in time to a pre-colonial African society in which a love similar to Isaiah's and Samuel's is being mirrored, giving it sort of a long lineage.
It's wonderful. Thank you for that. Karen would like to know, I think we would all like to know about the inspiration for writing this type of story. I think in a previous interview, you alluded to whispers from people whose stories haven't been told. Can you talk more about that?
Certainly. So when I was an undergrad, I was a creative writing major and an Africana studies minor. And in those subjects, I got to read a lot of great works by a lot of great authors. But what kept striking me as odd is that Black queer people don't show up in the literature until about the Harlem Renaissance period. So like the 1920s. I think the earliest reference I saw was 1929 in a book called The Blacker the Berry by Wallace Thurman. So I was very curious about the presence of Black queer people prior to that time period, in particular during antebellum slavery. So I read tons of works, did a lot of research, and it seemed that the only things that I could find at the time, so this is like maybe 2004, 2005, the only things I could find at the time were references to same-sex sexual assault or rape. And while I'm sure those things happened, they were documented in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs and fictionalized in Toni Morrison's Beloved, the question for me was, well, what about love? And so, because Toni Morrison herself said, if you cannot find the book you wish to read, then you must write it. I said, darn it, I'm going to have to write this book. And so in 2005, I started very early little notes taking about how could I write a book about something that I have no information on, really. And so that is how my journey started. Subsequently, it took me about 14 years to write The Prophets because I'm imagining all of this wholesale. But in the process of writing, other things started to pop up. Like when I was at the very tail end of it, this was like maybe 2019, there was this story about an enslaved man who became America's first drag queen. And I thought, so I wasn't imagining this. This people like this existed. And that sort of gave me the confirmation to go on. And that's one of the things I take as like the whispers
Yeah.
from ancestral spirits telling me that it is my job to be a witness to sort of inscribe the stories that have been ignored or erased or altogether wiped away from the historical record.
So it's very interesting. Was it a story that you came upon in your research, or was it written about by someone else who found it researching and you happened to read the article?
I happened to read the article
Wow.
in the Guardian, and I thought, wow.
Yeah.
And then after The Prophets was published, I started to see more and more of this information of people who were formerly enslaved and were in queer relationships or who were transgender, although we did not have that language back then and they did not have that language. They called themselves something different, but it was those categories that I had once believed could not have existed in that time period, but they in fact did. And further, an African scholar, she's from Ghana, her name is Esther Arma, and she talked about how the oral histories also spoke to these sorts of relationships in her tribes. Her father's people were called the Ga people, and they did not have words like homosexual or lesbian or transgender, but they did recognize that these people existed, and they found them to be just a normal part of nature. This is just a part of the human experience, and they did not ostracize them or think of them as anything inferior. And so knowing those sorts of things empowered me to write and eventually publish The Prophets.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. So 14 years, that's quite a long journey. Was it at any point in time, I mean, did it take you 14 years because you were developing this research? Was it kind of like fear of putting it out there? What was that journey like?
It was long and arduous, and it took so long because of the two of the things you mentioned. Research. I wanted to be certain that I could, that I had at least some stable ground to stand on if I'm going to write this story. It was also fear because I was afraid of how people might take me insinuating that queer people existed during a period of time that was brutal and is treated as sacrosanct by many in Black communities, and that perhaps they would think I was sullying this history by making this implication. So I was nervous about that. And then the other part was just finding the time. When I was in undergrad, I worked 3 part-time jobs to pay for my way through college. When I was in grad school, I worked 2 part-time jobs to help pay for my way through college. And then when I finally graduated, I had a full-time job. So I was trying to find the time to dedicate to this project that I wasn't even sure would ever be finished.
Yeah.
That I never thought other people would even want to read. So I had to sort of take a chance on myself. I said, you went to school for 6 years to learn how to be a writer. And so bet on yourself. Yeah. And so I said, I'll make a commitment. I said, I'll get up 3 o'clock every morning, write for at least 1 hour, go back to bed at 4 a.m., set the alarm to wake me up for 6:30 to go to work. So I did that every single day. And I did it for longer periods on the weekends. And it was those periods, which I call the magic hour, is when I got the chance to really commit myself to this work, to this book. And speaking of the whispers that you talked about, 3 a.m. is the most quiet time in Brooklyn, New York. So you hear absolutely nothing except occasionally these voices that you think, okay, I'm imagining things. Is this like my own head talking to me? Or is this something more? And so I allowed myself to believe that it was something more, and those voices guided me through this process.
You're not the first author that we've spoken with that has described their writing process as kind of like mystical and as if they were like a vessel. So I kind of feel like you're on the same plane there, what you're describing.
Very often, that's what it feels like. It feels like something else is taking over and using your body to get these words down. And I'll go back through the prophets sometimes and read passages that feel so completely written by someone else, because those were those moments which my husband calls the head in the cloud moments, where something else, whatever that creative energy force is, takes over.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. It kind of gives me goosebumps, like to think about things like that. So we have quite a few questions asking about the title of the book. So Abiola says, why did you choose this title? But I think to kind of go off of that, it might make sense to ask Fran's question, which is what prompted you to head the chapters with the Bible sections? Because I'm sure they're interrelated.
Yes. So another part of that fear was, once I started doing all of this research, it became very clear that the origin of anti-LGBTQIA plus sentiment came from colonizing spiritual institutions. So, for example, in many of the countries and peoples and tribes of Africa, Europeans came with Christianity, but there was also some people from other regions who came with Islam, would come and see that these African peoples were engaged in homosexual relationships or transgender expressions, and said this was sinful and they must stop these behaviors immediately. And the proof that they used was their own biblical or religious texts. Mm-hmm. And so they conquered these people and forced their religions onto them and forced them to abide by the rules of their spiritual practices. So once I discovered that, I was just like, gosh, now I'm going to have to confront that, because there's no way I can tell this story without confronting that truth. And one of the ways I wanted to confront it was not just directly, but in ways that are structural and creative. One of the things that I realized in reading a lot of the slave narratives was that when a person is enslaved, and when an African person was enslaved in this country or abroad, like in, say, South America and Brazil, the first thing the slave owner would do is change their name from whatever their cultural name was to a Christian name, as a means to sort of say, now me and my God have power over you. And you are now subject to my whims and the whims of my God. My God is more powerful than yours. And so I wanted to sort of play with that, with giving all of the characters Christian names. And then I wanted to actually think about the ways in which the Bible is used to oppress women, oppress Black people, to oppress queer people. And so I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename these chapters after parts of the Bible in a way to kind of be in conversation with other parts of the real Bible, sort of giving a different perspective. And I'm going to use some of the apocryphal chapters, the chapters that are left out of the official Bible, to say, sort of, here's the things that you're missing. Because when you read a book that has been censored, there are obviously truths that you're not going to have access to. And so those were the reasons why I sort of incorporated biblical names and biblical chapters into the construction of the prophets.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. It's so how somebody's brain can work that way on so many levels to pull all of that together and so beautifully. It's beautifully done. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we're starting to get some setting questions. Cynthia is asking, what made you create your writing during the slave era? The story is mostly set in Mississippi, but of course ranges widely, as you stated. There's kind of a mirrored relationship back on the African continent. So why was it so important for you to set those scenes? Well, I think, in Africa, you've already kind of explained that to show that it wasn't homosexuality, transsexual, transgender wasn't something that was seen as bad in Africa.
Right.
So
Correct.
Why then the slave era? Why antebellum slavery?
That's a really good question. I think part of it is, maybe the impetus for that was, there's this belief in some that is held by some members of some Black communities, that the reason Black people are queer or trans is because slavery was such a traumatic experience that it broke us. That slavery was so violent that it shook us from our natural state of heterosexuality and cisgenderness and turned us into something perverted. I just inherently knew that to be false. Something inside me told me that just simply could not be true. And that's what drove me toward the research, and why I was so relieved to find what I found about pre-colonial African societies in regard to their perspectives on sexual minorities. So I wanted to set it right there in the middle of antebellum slavery, in one of the places that was most cruel in its practice of slavery, which was Mississippi. Mississippi was one of the greatest sites of anti-Blackness in this country, but it was also and is also one of the sites of the greatest Black resistance. And so I wanted to focus it there for those two reasons. And also because one of my favorite actresses, Bea Richards, who passed away maybe a decade ago now, was born and raised in Mississippi, in Vicksburg, where my story takes place. And I did this as sort of an homage to her in the ways in which she inspired me to think about subjects of gender and sexuality and race in ways that I had not previously.
That's amazing. That's a little tidbit that is very personal. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So Samuel and Isaiah, the two main characters, they have this kind of sacred space for the two of them in the barn. Can you talk about why getting to create their own landscape, their own territory in the barn, why this is so important, and what this really allowed those characters to do?
I didn't realize as I was writing the book that the barn was operating as such a sanctuary. Mm-hmm. I was just, describing Samuel and Isaiah's privacy, which a lot of the other enslaved people didn't get to have. But then I realized upon when my editor Sally Kim and I were going through revisions, and she pointed out that this operates as such a safe space for not just Samuel and Isaiah, but almost anyone who comes into that space. I realized that maybe that's what I was trying to do subconsciously, was give their love a chance. And so in order for their love to have a chance, it had to have a safe space. And that safe space had to be recognized as a safe space by anyone who came into proximity of it, whether that was the other enslaved individuals, or even if it was some of the enslavers. Because when Paul and Ruth also venture into that space, they recognize that there's something different about this space, and it has something to do with the two of them who are together in this way that makes them very uncomfortable. So upon reflection, I realize now that that barn is necessary because it gives Samuel and Isaiah sort of cover, so that their love can be protected.
Hmm. Yeah, I have to say, like at the beginning of the book, when I first started reading the book, I was like, "You're in the barn. What are you doing?" I was so scared. I was so scared that like the conversations taking place, just their physicality with one another. I was like, what is going to happen? Something bad is going to happen. Like I just kept waiting for it, and then I then I realized, of course, you get further into the book, and it definitely becomes this place of safety. This.
It's such a bizarre situation because the barn is the closest to the big house that the plantation owners live in.
Hmm.
And so that's dangerous.
Yeah.
But it also affords them a bit of freedom because the masters know you're not going to try to do anything with me so close to you.
Sure.
So I don't have to watch you as hard as I have to watch the others who are further away. So it's a real interesting sort of dilemma.
Hmm. Well, it was wonderfully done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sonia is saying, my favorite chapter is Romans. There's so much healing in it for those of us that may have carried shame about our lineage. What was your inspiration and intention when writing this chapter?
um, I was thinking about the wages of slavery, specifically for people who are the descendants of the enslaved. How something that happened, and I was almost going to say so long ago, but it actually wasn't so long ago.
Yeah.
When I think about that, my grandfather's grandfather told him about how their tribe's king was brought over on a ship. So he was alive. My grandfather's grandfather was alive. So my grandfather knew someone who was enslaved, and I knew my grandfather. And so, like, I feel like that's so close. Um, but I wanted to sort of allow us to confront the history that we are all subject to, but not let it sort of not allow it to, or better yet, allow ourselves to heal from it. And the only way we can heal from it is if we acknowledge it, we don't turn away from it, but we realize that the sacrifices that our ancestors made for us were so that we don't forget, that we remember, but we also build something better, that we do something new, freer, more loving. And so Romans is sort of my push toward that idea that there's only one way to heal, and that is confronting the pain, because there's no escaping pain. I know that we are in a society now where discomfort is the worst possible thing anyone can experience, and so we want to ban books and change curricula and do all of these sorts of things. But the truth of the matter is, if we're going to call ourselves human beings, if we are going to get to our next level as a species, we have to grow up, and we have to realize that pain is a part of life, but so is healing. And once we've dealt with the pain, we can then deal with the healing.
Mhm. Well, thank you. Deborah is asking, how did it feel writing so many difficult but necessary points of view? From the white enslavers to the enslaved to the homes the enslaved were snatched from. Was it healing, heart wrenching? How do you take care of your mental health as you did the important work of doing justice to each point of view?
Wow, that is a really good question, because It was very difficult to write about this time period because it was so painful, because there was so much violence, rape and murder and abuse, that at some points when you're writing it, it's one thing, but then when you're reading it back to yourself, you almost feel it on your skin. And so I did things to restore myself, like go for long walks in Brooklyn, taking in nature, flowers and trees and children's laughter and people watching and things of that nature. I would do that. I would spend time with my nieces and nephews, or I would watch a good movie, or read a good book, a good, like a more, uplifting, cheerful book. I would cook my favorite meal, just small things to help me get through it, because in the back of my mind was always, you're just writing about it. You're just the witness for the people who actually had to endure it. So you better find a way to keep going. So I found those ways to do it. Meditation was also very helpful.
That's a very important point of view, that you better find a way to endure it. So Virginia wants to know, what inspired the two main characters? I know we talked about the inspiration of their sacred place, but what inspired them? What inspired their creation?
So initially, the prophets was called Sing, Hannibal, Bear Witness. And it was going to be one person's point of view, and that person was named Hannibal, and he was going to be telling someone what his life was like, and they were like kind of transcribing it for him, and they were going to, publish it as a slave narrative. That was how it was initially structured when I first started back in 2005, 2006. Mm. But then I realized something. I realized that Hannibal's point of view wasn't broad enough, that he needed to be in conversation maybe with the person who was the love of his life. So that is how Samuel, because Hannibal eventually became Isaiah, and then I brought in Samuel. And so then I had it as like sort of them talking to each other. That was the initial arrangement of the novel. And because I had them talking to each other, I had to distinguish them from one another. Why would Samuel like Isaiah? Why would Isaiah like Samuel? Who's meaner? Who's kinder? Who's taller? Who's fatter? Who smiles more? And then from that, those sort of comparisons, they started to develop their own personalities and voices, their own faces, the way they wore their hair, what their favorite colors were, what they liked to eat, what they smelled like, what their favorite flowers were. Like all of that stuff started to come just from me having them converse in this second iteration of the book. And then I realized why they loved each other is because when they first met as children, they were the first two that they could remember anyone ever looking completely in the eye with something other than hatred. And they bonded instantly. And I realized that is the thing that needs to be witnessed by everyone. So it can't just be Samuel and Isaiah. This book has to be witnessed by so many other people, including the people who despise their love. And so that's how the other people popped up. But Samuel and Isaiah came out of the need for love to be centralized in this book, and the need for me to distinguish the two of them from one another.
But yeah, you do such a wonderful job at weaving that moment in to each character's point of view. I just remember Essie walking up to the barn with the pie, and
oh yes,
and recalling, the moment that Samuel and Isaiah met herself. Yeah, it's a beautiful moment. You did a great job there. So it's interesting. You said you had to make them different people, and I kind of, not to such such a huge extent, but they're the yin and yang of one another almost. Like Isaiah, so optimistic and sweet, and Samuel doesn't trust anything, and he's a little more gruff. Um, and and
Yes.
you kind of it's like that throughout the book though, with like slave enslaver and enslaved, the yin and the yang of that. But you still how do you still find a way to make hope and love shine through, even in the context of such inhumanity?
That's a really good question because I go to Baldwin for this because James Baldwin, was asked a similar question about hope. Like, you write about such difficult things, about things that we're still wrestling with as a society. How do you keep going? And his response to the interviewer was, because what do I say to my nieces and nephews? That there's no hope? And so when I'm writing, I'm also thinking about the generations that are coming up behind me. I can't tell them that it can't be changed, because if that were true, then I wouldn't be here. If it can't be changed, I'd be in chains, at least visible chains. Because as we know, slavery still exists and is still a pernicious problem in global society. But I, in particular, as a Black person living in this country, I would certainly not be able to write this book, because it was illegal for my ancestors to do so, to read and write. So even though that might be something considered small or minuscule, that is still a sign of hope. And so I have to, in the writing of my work, in any writing that I do, as pessimistic as the subject matter might be, I have to allow for at least a sliver of hope, so that the person reading the book isn't despondent, because despair leads to inertia. And I don't want people who read my book to feel like there's nothing I can do, so I should just give up. I want them to think that if there is a small chance, then maybe I can contribute my little part, and someone else can contribute their little part. And then the accumulation of those small little parts lead to something greater that can be profound in its power to move us forward as a society.
Love and hope will find a way. We need people like you. That's good. Maria is asking, did you get inspiration from the social justice movement work when developing the characters and storyline? Amos reminds me of well-meaning, not-for-profit organizations that end up doing more harm than good.
Oh, that is such a great question, and I love the example that she used. In fact, my work on the platform Son of Baldwin, which I was the moderator for on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for about 14 years, I created as a tribute to James Baldwin back in 2007, 2008, helped tremendously in helping me think about things like identity. Because here in the United States of America, as a Black queer person, I have one sense of what it means to be queer. But I realized in these conversations on Son of Baldwin that a queer person in Brazil does not hold the same ideas that I hold. A transgender person in Ghana does not hold the same ideas that I hold. That they are different, though we are connected in our the ways in which we are struggling for liberation. Our personal contexts don't exactly line up. So it took me out of this mindset that the way that I think about things, educated in a Western system, is the way that it is for everybody, that my reality is everybody's reality, which is not true. That was a really important thing to be educated on. And it broadened my perspectives in ways that allowed me to then think about characters like Akusa and Kosai and Alewa, who are in the pre-colonial chapters of the book, and the ways in which they might look at the world differently from how I looked at it. And to realize that even though we looked at the world in different ways, we are still connected by our common humanity, by our common need to survive, to live and to love. So yeah.
Do you want to talk a bit about Amos to give the example context?
So Amos is one of my favorite characters in the book, I have to tell you, because he's in such a strange situation. So Amos is an older gentleman that lives on a plantation. He's enslaved, and he's attempting to curry favor with the master Paul by helping Paul convert Samuel and Isaiah to his very strict sort of view of sexual relations. He's trying to breed them because he thinks they're excellent at their jobs, and he wants them to have as many offspring as possible because he believes they will have good stock for his plantation. But when he happens to discover the nature of Samuel and Isaiah's relationship, he enlists Amos to sort of help me mold them. If you can do this, then I promise that I won't do any harm to someone that you love. It's Essie. So Amos loves Samuel and Isaiah, particularly Isaiah, because he came to the plantation with Isaiah in the same wagon. But he also recognizes how the stubbornness of Samuel and Isaiah could be harmful to everyone else on that plantation. So what he does is he uses religion as a cudgel, so that he can convert everyone else on the plantation, and the more other enslaved people he can convert to the master's religion, the more pressure that could be put on Samuel and Isaiah to acquiesce. And in real life, in real time, we have African-American pastors who are operating in those very ways, who are using Christianity as a means to get the congregation to forget about their suffering, because they can now take out their misery and aggression on another oppressed group, the LGBTQIA plus among them. And that is something that's been happening for centuries now. And Amos speaks to the historical part of that, but in some ways, as the reader noted, speaks to a contemporary mindset as well about how religions and what do you call them, missionary work does often undermine particular civilizations and societies.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Reese is asking, did your characters teach you anything about love and sacrifice as you were writing the novel?
Yes. King Akusa, who is a woman, or at least presents female, taught me that love has no boundaries, that it is expansive, not retractive. Isaiah taught me that love requires a kind of courage, that in the face of untold violence, Isaiah tells Samuel, I will still love you, even if it's only for this brief moment and they're going to snatch you out of my arms at any moment. I am going to still love you because I am a better person for having done that than to have not loved you at all. Maggie taught me a great deal about resilience, about how to be strategic in your rebellion against a system that you know is unjust, that you know is treating you unfairly. So these characters have, in fact, taught me a great deal. Even Paul and Ruth and James and Timothy taught me some things. They taught me how easy it is to be seduced away from your own humanity, such that you could look at somebody else and see them as something less than human. So even when I disagree, like I consider myself a progressive person who believes that individual rights should be protected, so women should have access to their own bodies and make decisions about their own bodies. And while I sternly disagree with people who think that they have the right to tell women what they can do with their bodies, I still see those people as human beings. So I don't harm their humanity as well. So yes, all of these characters teach me something.
Yeah. Maggie is my favorite. Amazing.
Everyone loves Maggie.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess for me, for obvious reasons, like a strong woman strategizing her way through a horrible situation is its own modality of power and what you can have anyway.
Maggie is actually a tribute to my great grandmother and her sisters. I had the great fortune of having my great grandmother and her sisters and her brothers as well for a great deal of my life. Like they were much older and they lived long lives. So I had them. I would go down to South Carolina in the summers. That's where my mother's mother's side of the family is from, and I'd spend summers with them, and they would teach me like farming and how to live off the land and stuff like that. And they were strong women who were not the kind of women that looked to men for protection. They looked to men for other things, pleasure, companionship, but not for protection. They protected themselves and they provided for themselves. They were very strong, very brave, and very funny women. Great senses of humor, amazing cooks, incredible storytellers. And Maggie is sort of she's them. She is my tribute to them because that's who I drew upon when I was trying to kind of constructing Maggie as a character.
That's amazing. I want to be their friend. You described everything that sounds awesome. Okay, so Karen says your book speaks to the radical power of love. Thank you. Where are you finding love today, and how can we continue to spread it?
I love questions about love. I really do, because I initially never thought of love as as a revolutionary force. I grew up like everyone else in America, watching soap operas and Hollywood films, and thinking of love as something like in the Cinderella or Snow White films. I didn't realize that love was work. It was like you have to make a commitment, like a ongoing commitment to it. It's not something that just comes naturally. I mean, maybe attractions do, but love is something beyond attraction. It is sort of this thing that says, no matter what, I will never degrade or dehumanize you. I will always respect your livingness, and I will never do you harm, no matter what. And that is such a revolutionary thing that it's scary, because how do you do that? How do you navigate a world like ours, saying, I promise that I will love you always and I will never do you harm no matter what? Because so many of us think of love in terms of, well, you hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you. But love says, you hurt me, I won't allow you to hurt me again, and I'll love you from a distance because you've made it such that I can't love you close up. So that's how I think about love. And where I find it is in my own home. I find it in my husband, in my family, in my friends, in my ancestors who must have loved me because of everything that they were willing to sacrifice and survive so that I could have a chance to be here doing what I'm doing now. I'm a full-time writer, something that maybe they couldn't even imagine, but had hoped. So love is abundant and it's everywhere. At least I find it such. I find it in things like the rain that replenishes our water system so that I can have fresh water to drink. I find it in and the plants that keep growing despite all the poisons we're putting into our environment so that we can eat. The sun shining down on me, giving me vitamin D, is a form of love. I just feel like the universe is so full of it, full of love, that you can't escape it unless you are intentionally trying to escape it and doing things against the I don't want to say against the order of the universe, because I don't know what the order of the universe is, but doing things that you know are harmful on purpose. Um, that's when you break with love. But I feel like if you are living the kind of life in which you are doing your best not to do harm, and that, in this world, that's a lot to ask. It's so, I mean, I have this shirt on. I have no idea if this was children who were forced to work to make this shirt that I purchased, which then supports a system that is doing harm. But to the best of my intentions, I try not to do harm, which I think is what love means.
I think that you should write a book about love.
Thanks. You're funny, Brandon.
Sorry.
I love it.
So Will is asking, what has been most meaningful to you about the response to the book? I read this over one weekend and was deeply affected by the community relationships to the protagonists in the book. It feels powerful to me to have represented so much implicit compassion in the way you did with these characters' stories.
Wow. Thank you, Will. That's very kind of you to say. What has touched me most is the ways in which this book is touching other people. So, for example, the only African country in which my book is legally available for purchase is South Africa. But I've been told that there's an underground in which this book is being passed around many African countries, Zimbabwe and Kenya, Nigeria and Ghana, just so many other African countries in which Black queer people and Black trans people are finding connection with this work, with each other, and then with me because of this work. That I did not anticipate, and it makes me feel like that's the reason why this book needed to be written, so that all across this globe, the people that feel isolated and alone recognize that both of those things are not true. They are not isolated, and they are never alone. That has been the most touching thing for me to discover, is to get an email from someone in a country where it's dangerous for them to be sending me this email to be announcing what they're announcing, to say, thank you for writing this book, because I thought that there was something wrong with me, and now I know there's not.
That's incredible. Mark is saying, any chance the Prophets will be turned into a movie?
Well, contractually, I can't say anything right now.
Okay.
But I can tell you that there is interest in that direction. And that is like kind of the most that I can say about that.
Okay. Well, I love that answer. I'm sure Mark might too.
I've cast the film in my head just to be, transparent.
Yeah.
I have cast the book in my head, but
oh man, that's just like so many more questions.
Oh.
So we have some people asking about your background in general, as unrelated to the Prophets, but it all, of course, brings you to writing the Prophets. But so Ken is saying, I'm curious about your personal history and upbringing. What inspired you to write? What was your journey to becoming a writer?
Okay. So I am born and raised in New York City. My father's side of the family, Robert Sr., he My father was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia. Came to New York in his late teens, early 20s. My mother was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, but her family is split from one side from South Carolina, my mother's side, and the other side, my mother's father's side, is from St. Kitts in the Caribbean. And I was raised in a house that was half Nation of Islam and half AME Zion, American Methodist Episcopalian Zion. Both of those religions. My mother was the rebel of the family. So she broke away from the family religion because she felt like there is no way in the world you're going to convince her that she's second class because she's a woman. Mm. That gave me the path and the courage to say there's no way in the world you're going to treat me as second class because I'm queer. So I broke away from the family religions as my mother did. But where my literary beginnings start is because my father, when I was about 4 years old, bought me a Wonder Woman comic book.
Yeah.
And I absolutely fell in love. And then I found out there was a Wonder Woman TV show with Linda Carter, and I absolutely fell in love all over again. And then at the age of 6, I was so enamored with Wonder Woman that I started writing stories where I was her sidekick.
That's amazing.
And that was the first time that my literary imagination was put down on paper.
Okay.
And it felt so good, so freeing to do that I just kept writing. Beyond Wonder Woman, I just kept writing. And then at age 16, I read a book called Mama, which is the debut novel of Terry McMillan, who wrote Waiting to Exhale and other great works, and realized that my own life could be the breeding ground for my literary imagination, that I could look at the world around me and comment on it through fiction. And at 16, I wrote my first novel, which I never finished, called Conjure. It's terrible, but it was the first attempt at writing something long form. And that felt really good. I felt so powerful and smart, intelligent in doing that work that I felt like I wanted to keep doing that kind of thing. And so I kept doing it, even when I wasn't officially a published writer or anything like that. I was always writing. No matter what job I held, no matter what I was doing, I was always writing, and recognized pretty late, maybe at 31 years old, that writing was in fact why I'm here. It is my purpose.
Mm-hmm. What was that? What did that revelation entail?
I lost my job at Bank of America and was deciding what I should do next because I was in panic mode. I grew up in we were impoverished for quite a number of years. And so poverty is a traumatizing situation where you're always scared about where your next paycheck is coming from, where your next meal is coming from, if you're going to be able to provide shelter for yourself and things of that nature. So when I lost my job, I went into panic mode about I have to now hustle to find another job so that I can keep a roof over my head and food in my belly. But then another voice sort of crept in. And that voice came off of the Oprah Winfrey Show. As I was looking through the want ads, had the television on, and Oprah was on, and this gentleman said, you've been running from your purpose for your entire life. It's that thing that comes so naturally to you. It's like second nature. It's the thing that you're so good at that you almost don't have to be trained to do it. It's that thing that you are scared to death that you will fail at. But what I want you to do is not think about the last step you have to take in order to be that thing, but what's the next step, the first step that you have to take to be that thing. So on my journey down to the unemployment office, I come face to face with this sign that says at the top, if you want to be A, then you have to do this. So in one column, it tells you if you want to be an engineer or what have you. Second column, this is what you have to do next. And so I'm going down and it's alphabetized. I'm going down the list of professions, and near the bottom is writer. And I move over and it says, go to college. And at age 31, I called up my mother, said, Ma, I want to move back home because I want to go back to school and become a writer. She said, your room's still here. And that was how I did it.
VT is saying, thank you for your insights on love. You're such an amazing and loving human being. Can you please give any advice to someone who wants to become a writer and a best-selling author, but hasn't even completed their undergraduate degree yet?
Yes. My first piece of advice is write. Even if you think it's awful, even if you are scared of it, even if you don't want to show it to anyone else, write. Because here's the blessing and the curse of being a writer. You are always a better writer today than you were yesterday. You are never as good a writer today as you will be tomorrow. But you must always chase tomorrow. So first things first, always write. Second thing, have a very trusted friend or associate who you could show your writing to when you have the courage to do so, who will be honest with you about your writing. And honest doesn't mean mean. And it doesn't mean telling you everything you want to hear. It means identifying what works and identifying what does not, so that you can become a better writer when you go to your revisions, because writing is revision. The other thing is, I hear a lot of people saying, try to get published with like small literary magazines or things of that nature. And I don't know if that's as important now, given that we have blogs and newsletters and all of these things where you can build your own audience. But if you want to practice by doing that, so that you get some professional opinions on your work, like by editors and such, and editing is such an unsung profession. Editors are some of the most valuable people in the world to a writer. So shout out to all the editors. But yes, the main thing though is to keep writing, so that you get your 10,000 hours, they say, of writing, so that you become an expert at it. But more than that, it becomes your spiritual practice. You are becoming this artist, and artists are always at work on their craft. So just keep writing is my advice to any novice writers or writers who think of themselves as not yet professional.
Wonderful advice. Thank you. Celeste says, your newsletter has led me to several new reads and authors. Thank you for that. Any general tips on how to support emerging voices or non-binary perspectives in publishing are welcome.
Penguin Random House does this wonderful thing every year where they compile all of their LGBTQIA non-binary works and authors, new literary voices, old literary voices, so that there's this one centralized location for people who want to know how to support these emerging voices. Also, I had the pleasure of being a part of something called the Lit 16, the creation of Disha Philyaw, who wrote The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. We put together this sort of thing to recognize new and emerging writers from marginalized communities who are not getting that sort of attention that they want to get, that we think they deserve because they're such great, talented writers. Those are part of the ways in which we kind of help to put a spotlight on those sorts of people. So look out for the Lit 16. Check out Penguin Random House's website. Do like a global LGBTQ search on their website, and you'll be drawn to all the resources that'll point you in the right direction.
Great, thank you. Jennifer wants to know, what are you working on now? Any projects we should be on the lookout for?
I am 60,000 words into my second novel.
Ooh, so
I'm very, very excited. It will not take me 14 years to write this one. It's going at a very quick pace. These characters are coming very quickly to me. It is still historical fiction, but it's more in the present. I'm dealing with like the 1980s, 90s. So it's coming along quickly, and I hope people enjoy this book as much as they enjoyed The Prophets.
I am sure that we will. One last quick question we like to close with, and Laura Beth has reminded me, what books do you recommend to us readers to run to our libraries and check out immediately?
Number one is The Final Revival of Opal and Nev by Donnie Walton. That was my favorite book of 2021. The year my book came out, that was my favorite book. That is an amazing, amazing book. I love that book so very much.
That is
that's fiction. For nonfiction, I would recommend Shouting in the Fire by Dante Stewart. It's a memoir about a young black man's coming of age in the South during a period of great turmoil in the country. It is written with such power. He reminds me of a young James Baldwin. He writes with that same sort of passion and vigor. It was really, really great. Those are my two top reads for fiction and nonfiction.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. The hour has just flown by. It's been such a pleasure, talking to you for the last hour. Thank you, truly.
It has been my pleasure. I love libraries. Librarians are heroes, superheroes, and thank you so much for everything you guys do.
Amazing. With that, I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning into our author talk today. Of course, without your support, none of this would even be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video, you can find a link to Robert's book under that resources tab. We look forward to seeing you all on August 23rd when we chat with New York Times bestselling YA author Cassandra Clare, and again on August 30th when we talk to college admissions expert and New York Times bestselling author Jeff Zelingo. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.